In May 2023, a single fingerprint on a coffee cup forgotten in evidence for 18 years becomes the key to solving a murder that destroyed a small upstate New York farming community. But the name it revealed was the last person anyone expected. In the basement of the Greene County Sheriff's Department, beneath flickering fluorescent lights and between towers of moldering case files, Detective Emily Carter held a manila folder that would shatter everything the residents of Pine Hollow thought they knew about September 15, 2003. The partial print, lifted from a white ceramic mug, barely visible even under magnification, belonged to someone who had never appeared in a single witness statement, never been questioned, never even been considered a person of interest. Someone who had attended Helen Foster's funeral, had helped carry her casket, had looked her grieving family in the eyes and offered his condolences. The advanced fingerprint analysis system had been running comparisons for 3 months when it finally found a match in the Florida Department of Motor Vehicles database. James O'Connor, age 52, last known address in Tampa. The same Jimmy O'Connor who had fixed farm equipment throughout Greene County for nearly a decade, who had worked on the Foster family's tractor just 2 months before Helen disappeared, who had simply vanished from the community sometime in 2004 without anyone thinking to ask why. The revelation sent Detective Carter reaching for her phone with trembling fingers, knowing she was about to reopen wounds that had never properly healed. If you're fascinated by how modern forensic technology is finally bringing justice to long-forgotten victims, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because this is just the beginning of a story that will challenge everything you think you know about trust, deception, and the secrets that small communities keep buried. Helen Foster had been the kind of person who brought casseroles to new neighbors and remembered everyone's birthday. Her disappearance hadn't just been a crime. It had been the death of innocence in a place where people still left their doors unlocked, and children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. The coffee cup that would eventually solve her murder had been processed as evidence, photographed, cataloged, and then stored in a climate-controlled room where it waited through 4 different sheriff administrations and countless budget cuts that repeatedly delayed the technological upgrades that might have identified its secret years earlier. Jimmy O'Connor's name appeared nowhere in the original case files that Detective Carter had memorized over the past 6 months since taking over the cold case unit. Not in witness statements, not in the list of local contractors and service providers, not even in the background checks of peripheral figures who had crossed paths with the Foster family. He was a ghost who had hidden in plain sight, someone so unremarkable that even in a community of 847 people, he had managed to remain invisible to investigators who thought they had talked to everyone who mattered. The fingerprint told a different story. A story written in the microscopic ridges and valleys that had pressed against ceramic on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning nearly 2 decades ago. September 15, 2003 dawned crisp and clear in Pine Hollow, with the kind of golden autumn light that makes even the most mundane moments feel touched by grace. Helen O'Connor, as everyone called her, moved through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to find joy in repetition. Coffee first, always the large white ceramic mug with the chipped handle that her daughter Sophie had made in elementary school art class. The mug sat waiting on the O'Connor counter, positioned next to the ancient Mr. Coffee machine that gurgled and hissed its way through the brewing process while she prepared breakfast for her family. 2 eggs over easy for Mark, scrambled for herself, and cereal for Sophie 9 and Ben 6, who would stumble downstairs within the hour, demanding to know if the school bus was coming and whether they could have pancakes instead. The O'Connor window offered a view of the dirt road that connected their property to Route 44, where an occasional pickup truck would rumble past carrying farmers to their morning chores. Helen stood at that window, steam from her coffee mug fogging the glass as she watched the sun climb higher over the hills that surrounded their valley like protective arms. She had been raised in Syracuse, but 15 years in Pine Hollow had taught her to read the sky like scripture, to know from the color of the morning light whether rain would come before evening, whether the frost would be heavy enough to bring the last of the garden vegetables inside. At 7:15, she kissed Mark goodbye as he headed out to check the cattle, reminded Sophie to pack her lunch money, and helped Ben find his missing sneaker under the O'Connor table. The children caught the bus at the end of their long driveway, and Helen waved from the porch until the yellow vehicle disappeared around the bend. She had planned to spend the morning working in her vegetable garden, harvesting the last of the tomatoes before the frost that the Weather Service had promised for later in the week. Instead, she found herself walking back inside to refill her coffee mug, drawn by an unrestlessness she couldn't quite name. The phone rang at 8:47. Her sister Rachel calling from Albany to discuss plans for their mother's upcoming birthday party. They talked for 20 minutes about cake flavors and guest lists, while Helen absently stirred milk into her fresh coffee, the same white ceramic mug warming her hands as she paced the length of the O'Connor phone cord. Rachel would later remember that Helen had sounded tired, distracted, mentioning that one of their farm equipment pieces needed repair and that Mark was frustrated by the expense of calling in a mechanic again. At 9:15, Helen poured the remaining coffee from her mug into a thermos, grabbed her purse and keys, and walked out to the red Chevy pickup truck that Mark had bought her for Christmas 3 years earlier. She had errands to run in town: the bank, the pharmacy, and a stop at Miller's Diner to pick up the apple pie she had ordered for the volunteer fire department's monthly dinner. The white ceramic mug sat abandoned on the O'Connor counter, bearing the invisible signature of someone who would never return home to wash it. Mark Foster finished checking the fence line along the eastern pasture, just as the school bus delivered Sophie and Ben back to the end of their driveway at 3:45. He could hear their voices carrying across the field as they walked up the dirt road, Sophie's higher pitch mixing with Ben's excited chatter about something that had happened during recess. The sound made him smile, despite his lingering irritation about the broken hay baler that would cost them at least $800 to repair, money they didn't have, not with winter feed costs looming and the mortgage payment due next week. He expected to find Helen in the O'Connor, helping the children with homework, while something savory was simmering on the stove. Instead, he discovered Sophie standing uncertainly in the empty house, her backpack still strapped to her shoulders, calling for her mother in a voice that grew smaller with each unanswered call. Ben had already found the cookie jar and was methodically working his way through the chocolate chip remains, apparently unconcerned by their mother's absence. He noticed the white ceramic mug sitting on the counter, a brown ring of dried coffee staining its bottom, and felt the first flutter of unease in his chest. "Maybe she's still in town," Sophie offered when Mark asked if they had seen their mother's truck. "Mrs. Peterson said she saw Mom at the bank this morning." But Mark knew Helen's patterns, knew she never stayed out past school pickup when out calling, knew she would have been home by now with the apple pie for tonight's fire department dinner, and a dozen small complaints about the traffic on Route 44. He tried calling Miller's Diner, but the owner, Tom Miller, said Helen had picked up her pie order around 11:30 and had seemed perfectly normal, maybe a little quiet, but nothing that had struck him as unusual. By 5 o'clock, Mark's unease had crystallized into genuine worry. He called Rachel in Albany, hoping Helen had decided to make an impromptu visit to her sister, but Rachel hadn't heard from her since their morning phone conversation. The volunteer fire department dinner was scheduled to begin at 6, and Helen had never missed one in 12 years. Mark loaded the children into his truck and drove the route between their house and town, scanning the roadside for any sign of the red Chevy, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to leave marks. They found the truck at 6:27, pulled off on the shoulder of Route 44, about 3 miles from Miller's Diner, positioned as if Helen had simply decided to stop and admire the view of Patterson Creek winding through the valley below. The engine was still running, the
the driver's door hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet intact, $73 in cash undisturbed. Next to it, a white ceramic cup from Miller's Diner held the remnants of what appeared to be coffee purchased hours earlier, the liquid long since cooled to room temperature. Mark stood beside the truck for several minutes, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. Sophie began crying softly in the back seat of his pickup, while Ben asked repeatedly why Mommy's truck was there, but Mommy wasn't. The keys were still in the ignition, the radio still playing the country station Helen preferred, Patsy Cline's voice drifting into the gathering dusk with words about walking after midnight. Mark finally turned off the engine and called Sheriff Bill Harmon from his cell phone, his voice shaking as he tried to explain that his wife appeared to have simply vanished into thin air. Sheriff Bill Harmon had been elected to his position largely because he looked the part, tall, weathered, with the kind of steady presence that made people feel safer when he walked into a room. He had handled his share of domestic disputes, drunk driving accidents, and the occasional burglary, but nothing in his 23 years of law enforcement had prepared him for the sight of Helen Foster's abandoned truck sitting on Route 44 like a riddle without an answer. The immediate area showed no signs of struggle, no skid marks to suggest sudden braking, no broken glass or torn fabric to indicate violence. It was as if Helen had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the material evidence of a life interrupted mid-sentence. Within hours, Harmon had called in favors from 3 neighboring counties, transforming the quiet Tuesday evening into a carefully orchestrated emergency response. The initial search team included 2 bloodhounds from the state police, a helicopter crew from Albany, and 47 volunteers who had heard about Helen's disappearance through the rapid-fire communication network that connected every household in Pine Hollow. By Wednesday morning, the number had swelled to over 200 people, representing nearly a quarter of the county's population, all united by the desperate need to bring home a woman who had never hurt anyone and whose children were asking questions that no one knew how to answer. The search grid covered 15 square miles of some of the most challenging terrain in eastern New York, dense forests that had been growing untouched for decades, creek beds that could hide a body for years, abandoned farm buildings that offered countless hiding places for evidence or worse. Volunteers walked arm in arm through fields where the corn still stood 8 feet high, calling Helen's name until their voices became hoarse whispers. The bloodhounds picked up her scent near the truck and followed it for roughly 50 yards into the woods before losing the trail at a small stream that fed into Patterson Creek. Tom Miller closed his diner for the first time in 15 years to join the search, bringing thermoses of coffee and sandwiches for the volunteers who refused to stop even when darkness made their efforts dangerous. The local churches organized rotating prayer vigils, while the elementary school counselor worked overtime, helping Sophie and Ben process the incomprehensible reality that their mother had simply vanished into thin air. Mark Foster searched with the desperate intensity of a man who believed he could will his wife back into existence through sheer force of determination, his face growing more gaunt with each passing day. By Friday, the search had expanded to include dive teams in Patterson Creek and the nearby Quickchee Lake, while helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the forests that covered the hills surrounding Pine Hollow. The state police brought in cadaver dogs, whose specialized training made everyone's stomach clench with the implications of their presence. Local television news crews arrived from Albany and Poughkeepsie, transforming the quiet farming community into an unwelcome spectacle where reporters thrust microphones at grieving neighbors and asked the same unanswerable questions over and over. Sheriff Harmon found himself coordinating a massive operation while simultaneously conducting the most important investigation of his career. The evidence from Helen's truck had been carefully collected and sent to the state crime laboratory, but initial processing would take weeks. The white ceramic cup from Miller's Diner received particular attention from forensic technicians who dusted it for fingerprints, swabbed it for DNA, and photographed it from every possible angle before sealing it in an evidence bag that would eventually find its way to a storage room where it would wait 18 years for technology advanced enough to read the secrets it contained. The search continued for 10 days, covering an area that eventually encompassed over 40 square miles, but Margaret Miller remained as elusive as smoke. The volunteers gradually returned to their normal routines, though many would continue driving alternate routes home from work for months afterwards, still hoping to spot some sign of the woman who had vanished without explanation from a road she had traveled countless times before. October 8th, 2003 dawned gray and drizzling, the kind of miserable weather that made even the most optimistic residents of Pine Hollow feel as though the world was slowly drowning in sorrow. 23 days had passed since Helen Foster's disappearance, and the massive search effort had dwindled to a handful of dedicated volunteers who continued combing the woods on weekends, their voices hoarse from calling a name that never received an answer. The national media attention had moved on to fresher tragedies, leaving Pine Hollow to wrestle with its grief in private, the way small communities always do when the cameras stop rolling and the world forgets their pain. Jimmy Patterson had been fishing Oakwood Creek since he was old enough to hold a rod, following the winding waterway that connected Patterson Creek to the Hudson River through 12 miles of some of the most isolated wilderness in Greene County. At 71, he knew every bend, every deep pool where the trout liked to hide, every fallen log that created the perfect ambush point for a patient angler. He had come to the creek that morning seeking the kind of solitude that only water and silence could provide, hoping to catch enough fish for dinner and maybe find a few hours of peace from the constant tension that had gripped his community since Helen vanished. The body appeared around a bend in the creek, where the water deepened into a natural pool, caught against a fallen birch tree whose white bark had been stained dark by weeks of autumn rain. Jimmy saw the flash of fabric first, pale blue denim that looked foreign against the brown and gold of the October landscape. His initial thought was that someone had dumped trash in his fishing spot. But as he waded closer through water that reached his knees, the terrible reality began to take shape. What he had mistaken for debris was unmistakably human, the remains so altered by time and water that identification would require forensic expertise far beyond anything available in Pine Hollow. Sheriff Harmon received Jimmy's call at 11:47 in the morning, the old man's voice barely audible over the sound of his own sobbing.
The location was nearly 12 miles downstream from where Helen's truck had been found, accessible only by hiking through dense forest or following the creek itself through terrain that would challenge even experienced outdoorsmen. The state police arrived within 2 hours, accompanied by the medical examiner and a team of forensic specialists who immediately cordoned off the area and began the painstaking process of documenting the scene. The recovery took 6 hours, complicated by the remote location and the delicate nature of remains that had been submerged for weeks. Every piece of fabric, every fragment of bone, every item that might have been personal effects was carefully cataloged and photographed before being transported to the State Crime Laboratory in Albany. The white ceramic coffee cup from Miller's Diner, found buried in silt near where the body had been discovered, received particular attention from forensic technicians who recognized its potential importance but lacked the advanced fingerprint analysis technology that might have unlocked its secrets. Dr. Susan Lynn, the state medical examiner, spent 3 days conducting the autopsy that would officially confirm what everyone in Pine Hollow already knew in their hearts. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy object or thrown against something solid. The manner of death was ruled a homicide, transforming Helen's disappearance from a missing person case into a murder investigation that would consume Sheriff Harmon's department for months to come. The news of the discovery spread through Pine Hollow with the speed and devastation of wildfire, destroying the last fragile hopes that Helen might somehow still be alive, might someday walk through her front door with an explanation that would make everything make sense again. Mark Foster collapsed in the O'Connor when Harmon delivered the official notification, his knees hitting the linoleum floor where his wife had stood just weeks earlier, stirring milk into her coffee and planning a day that would never end the way she expected. The transformation of Helen Foster's disappearance into a homicide investigation brought a new intensity to the questioning that had been ongoing since September. Sheriff Harmon found himself conducting interviews that felt more like interrogations, following protocols designed for urban police departments and trying to apply them to a community where everyone had known everyone else for generations. The statistical reality that most women are killed by someone close to them pointed the investigation toward Mark Foster with an inevitability that made Harmon's stomach turn, even as he recognized the professional necessity of treating Helen's husband as the primary suspect. Mark submitted to 3 separate polygraph examinations, each one leaving him more emotionally shattered than the last. The questions came in waves, designed to break down psychological defenses. Did you kill your wife? Did you move her body? Do you know who killed your wife? Repeated with slight variations until Mark's answers became mechanical recitations of innocence that somehow sounded less convincing with each variation. The polygraph results were inconclusive, neither clearing him nor providing evidence of deception, leaving investigators with the frustrating reality that their primary suspect appeared to be genuinely devastated by his wife's death. The investigation into Mark's background revealed a man whose relationship with alcohol had complicated his marriage for years. Neighbors reluctantly admitted to hearing raised voices from the Foster house on several occasions, though no one could recall specific incidents of physical violence. Tom Miller mentioned that Mark had been drinking more heavily in recent months, sometimes appearing at the diner before noon with the telltale signs of someone trying to cure a hangover with coffee and greasy food. The pattern suggested a man under stress, possibly prone to explosive behavior, but it fell short of providing evidence that he had murdered his wife. Harmon spent weeks reconstructing the timeline of September 15th, interviewing everyone who might have seen Helen during her final day. The bank teller remembered her making a deposit around 10:30, noting that she had seemed distracted but not upset. The pharmacy clerk recalled filling her prescription for blood pressure medication, a routine transaction that revealed nothing unusual. Tom Miller's account of her visit to the diner remained consistent through multiple interviews. She had picked up the apple pie she had ordered, paid in cash, and left without engaging in the kind of casual conversation that was typical for her. The forensic evidence from Helen's truck and the crime scene provided tantalizing fragments of information that refused to coalesce into a coherent narrative. Fiber analysis revealed traces of material that didn't match anything in the Foster household, suggesting contact with an unknown person or location. The white ceramic coffee cup yielded several partial fingerprints, but the technology available in 2003 could only determine that some of them didn't belong to Helen, Tom Miller, or the diner staff who regularly handled the restaurant's dishes. Investigators expanded their focus to include other men in Helen's life, conducting interviews with the mail carrier, the veterinarian who treated their cattle, and the various contractors who had worked on their property over the years. Each conversation revealed the same portrait of a woman who was friendly but not flirtatious, helpful but not intrusive, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and brought soup to sick neighbors without making a production of her kindness. No one could imagine who might have wanted to hurt her, and no one had noticed anything unusual in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The investigation gradually began to focus on the possibility that Helen had been the victim of a random crime, perhaps interrupted during a robbery attempt or targeted by someone passing through the area. Route 44 carried enough traffic to make such a scenario plausible, and the remote location where her body was found suggested someone with local knowledge of the terrain. But without witnesses, without clear forensic evidence, and without a suspect who could be connected to the crime, the investigation began to lose momentum as autumn turned to winter and other cases demanded Sheriff Harmon's attention. By Christmas 2003, Helen Foster's murder had become what law enforcement agencies euphemistically call a cold case, the file relegated to a metal cabinet where it would gather dust for years while her family struggled to rebuild their lives around the permanent absence of a woman whose killer remained free, anonymous, and seemingly beyond the reach of justice. Rachel Foster became a woman possessed by the weight of unanswered questions, her life gradually consumed by an investigation that law enforcement had essentially abandoned. While Mark Foster struggled to raise Sophie and Ben alone, drinking himself into a stupor most nights and barely managing to keep the farm operational, Rachel transformed her grief into a relentless campaign for justice that would define the next 18 years of her existence. She converted the spare bedroom of her Albany apartment into a makeshift command center, covering every wall with photographs, timelines, maps, and copies of police reports that she had obtained through dozens of Freedom of Information Act requests. Every September 15th, Rachel organized memorial vigils in Pine Hollow, standing on the exact spot where Helen's truck had been found, and speaking to whoever would listen about the woman who had been forgotten by everyone except her family. The attendance dwindled over the years, from hundreds to dozens, to eventually just Rachel herself, standing alone on the shoulder of Route 44, with a handful of wilted flowers and a determination that bordered on obsession. She maintained a website dedicated to Helen's case, updating it religiously with new theories, potential leads, and appeals for information that generated dozens of calls from well-meaning strangers and conspiracy theorists, but never produced the breakthrough she desperately sought. The private investigators Rachel hired over the years consumed her modest teacher's salary and eventually forced her to take out a second mortgage on her small house. Each detective promised fresh eyes and new approaches, but they all eventually reached the same frustrated conclusion that had stymied Sheriff Harmon. The case lacked the kind of physical evidence or witness testimony that could point definitively toward a suspect. Rachel refused to accept their professional assessments, convinced that somewhere in the mountains of documentation she had accumulated lay the key to identifying her sister's killer. She attended every forensic science conference she could afford, learning about advances in DNA technology, forensic linguistics,
analysis, fingerprint enhancement, and digital evidence recovery. Rachel pestered the Greene County Sheriff's Department with such persistence that deputies began screening her calls, tired of explaining that the evidence had been re-examined multiple times without yielding new information. She wrote letters to television producers, documentary filmmakers, and true crime podcasters, begging them to feature Helen's case and offering to provide whatever assistance they needed to tell her sister's story. The toll of Rachel's crusade became evident to everyone who knew her. She never married, never had children, never pursued the hobbies and relationships that might have provided some relief from the constant ache of loss. Her colleagues at the elementary school where she taught 5th grade watched her transform from an energetic educator into a hollow-eyed woman who seemed to exist only on weekends and holidays when she could devote herself fully to investigating her sister's murder. She kept detailed files on every person who had lived in Pine Hollow during 2003, tracking their movements through social media and public records, convinced that Helen's killer was hiding in plain sight. Rachel's relationship with Mark and her niece and nephew suffered under the weight of her obsession. Mark eventually stopped returning her calls, exhausted by conversations that always circled back to the case and frustrated by Rachel's implicit suggestion that he wasn't doing enough to find justice for his wife. Sophie and Ben learned to dread their aunt's visits, which inevitably included lengthy discussions about their mother's death and pointed questions about memories they had tried hard to forget. By 2020, Rachel was 58 years old and looked at least a decade older, her hair prematurely gray and her face etched with lines that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much disappointment. She had spent nearly half her life pursuing a ghost, following leads that went nowhere, and chasing theories that collapsed under scrutiny. Yet she continued to believe that advances in forensic technology would eventually provide the answers that traditional detective work had failed to uncover. She had no way of knowing that in a climate-controlled evidence room 12 miles away, a white ceramic coffee cup was waiting for technology that would finally read the secrets it had been keeping for 18 years. Detective Emily Carter inherited Helen Foster's case file in January 2021, along with 47 other cold cases that had been gathering dust in the basement of the Greene County Sheriff's Department. At 34, Carter was the youngest detective ever assigned to the cold case unit, chosen specifically because Sheriff Robert Hayes believed that fresh eyes and modern training might breathe new life into investigations that had stalled under previous administrations. The Foster file was thicker than most, filled with witness statements, forensic reports, and hundreds of pages of notes that documented 18 years of frustrated effort. Carter spent her first 3 months systematically reviewing every piece of evidence, looking for connections that earlier investigators might have missed. The white ceramic coffee cup from Miller's Diner particularly intrigued her, not because it seemed more important than other evidence, but because the fingerprint analysis report from 2003 noted the presence of several partial prints that had been impossible to identify using the technology available at the time. Carter knew that fingerprint analysis had advanced dramatically over the past 2 decades, with new algorithms capable of extracting usable data from impressions that would have been considered worthless in earlier eras. The advanced fingerprint identification system that the State Crime Laboratory had installed in 2019 represented a quantum leap in forensic capability, using artificial intelligence and enhanced digital imaging to analyze prints that human examiners had dismissed as too fragmentary or degraded to be useful. Carter submitted a formal request to have all unidentified prints from the Foster case reprocessed using the new technology, a procedure that required approval from 3 levels of bureaucracy and carried a price tag that made budget-conscious administrators wince. The coffee cup arrived at the laboratory in Albany on March 15, 2021, still sealed in the same evidence bag that had preserved it for 18 years. Senior forensic examiner Dr. Susan Lynn handled the cup with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, understanding that she might be holding the key to solving a murder that had haunted a rural community for nearly 2 decades. The new scanning technology could detect ridge patterns and minutia points that were invisible to earlier analysis, creating a digital map of fingerprint characteristics with unprecedented detail and accuracy. The partial print that changed everything measured only 12 millimeters by 8 millimeters, located on the handle of the cup where someone had gripped it while drinking. Previous analysis had noted its presence but deemed it too incomplete for comparison against existing databases. The new system identified 47 distinct minutia points within that tiny area, enough to generate a search query that was automatically compared against millions of prints in state and federal databases. The match came back on April 3rd at 2:17 in the afternoon, appearing on Dr. Lin's computer screen with the kind of clinical precision that belied its earth-shaking implications. James O'Connor, also known as Jimmy O'Connor, date of birth July 12, 1969, fingerprints on file with the Florida Department of Motor Vehicles as part of his commercial driver's license application. Current address listed as 3247 Cypress Avenue, Tampa, Florida. No criminal record, no previous contact with law enforcement. No reason that anyone in Pine Hollow would have suspected him of involvement in Helen Foster's death. Carter stared at the computer screen for several minutes, feeling the weight of 18 years of unanswered questions suddenly crystallizing into a name and an address. James O'Connor had been living openly in Florida for over a decade, working as a mechanic for a trucking company, paying taxes, renewing his driver's license, completely unaware that advancing technology had finally connected him to a crime he thought he had gotten away with. The revelation was simultaneously satisfying and disturbing. Satisfying because it represented a breakthrough that could finally bring justice for Helen Foster. Disturbing because it suggested how many other cold cases might be solved if departments had the resources to re-examine old evidence using modern techniques. The investigation that followed would require careful coordination between New York and Florida law enforcement, but Carter knew she was holding something more precious than gold. After 18 years of silence, Helen Foster's coffee cup had finally found its voice. James O'Connor was replacing brake pads on a Peterbilt 118-wheeler when the coordinated law enforcement teams surrounded Rodriguez Brothers Trucking on the morning of April 18, 2021. The 52-year-old mechanic had been working at the Tampa facility for 7 years, known to his colleagues as a quiet, reliable man who kept to himself and rarely spoke about his past. He looked up from the wheel assembly he was servicing to see Detective Carter flanked by 2 Tampa-Hillsborough County deputies, their presence in the humid Florida garage creating an atmosphere of tension that made the other mechanics step back and watch in silence. O'Connor's face registered confusion rather than fear when Carter identified herself and explained that he was under arrest for the murder of Helen Foster. He wiped his grease-stained hands on a shop rag and asked quietly who Helen Foster was, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine bewilderment. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with the sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of the garage, where hydraulic lifts had stopped hissing and air guns had fallen quiet as workers tried to process the surreal scene unfolding before them. The extradition process took 6 weeks, during which O'Connor remained in a Tampa jail cell, maintaining his innocence while his court-appointed attorney argued against sending him back to New York. During those weeks, Carter conducted extensive background research that revealed a man who had lived an unremarkable life in Florida, working steady jobs, paying rent on time, and displaying none of the behavioral patterns typically associated with violent criminals. His employer described him as dependable and skilled, someone who arrived early and stayed late when necessary, who rarely called in sick and had never caused problems with coworkers or customers. O'Connor finally returned to Greene County on June 2nd, transported in a sheriff's department van that retraced the route Helen Foster had driven on her final morning 18 years earlier. Carter had spent months preparing for the interrogation that would either solve the case definitively or leave them with a suspect whose connection to the crime remained frustratingly circumstantial.
The interview room at the sheriff's department had been equipped with new recording equipment and cameras designed to capture every nuance of expression and body language. For 6 hours, O'Connor maintained his innocence with a consistency that began to wear down even Carter's certainty. He claimed no memory of ever being in Pine Hollow, insisted he had never met Helen Foster, and appeared genuinely confused by the accusation that he had murdered a woman whose name meant nothing to him. His attorney repeatedly pointed out that a fingerprint on a coffee cup proved nothing more than innocent contact, and that there had to be some explanation for his client's presence at what might have been a completely innocent encounter. The breakthrough came during the 7th hour of questioning, when Carter shifted tactics and began talking about Helen Foster not as a victim, but as a person, a mother of 2 young children, a woman who brought casseroles to sick neighbors, someone whose disappearance had devastated an entire community. O'Connor's composure began to crack as Carter described Sophie and Ben Brennan growing up without their mother, Mark Foster drinking himself into an early grave, Rachel Foster sacrificing her entire adult life to the search for justice. When O'Connor finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, the words seeming to emerge from someplace deep and long buried. He had been working on farm equipment throughout Greene County in 2003, he admitted, driving from job to job in a pickup truck that he had since sold. He remembered stopping at Miller's Diner on September 15th for coffee and breakfast, remembered seeing a woman sitting alone at a corner table, remembered following her when she left because something about her had seemed vulnerable, accessible. The confession that followed was delivered in fragments, interrupted by long silences and moments when O'Connor seemed surprised by his own words. He described following Helen's truck, forcing her to pull over by getting too close to her rear bumper, approaching her vehicle with the intention of robbery. When she had resisted, when she had started screaming, something had snapped inside him, and he had struck her with a tire iron he kept in his truck for changing wheels. The news of James O'Connor's confession spread through Pine Hollow with the same devastating swiftness that had marked Helen Foster's disappearance 18 years earlier. But this time, the community struggled to process relief rather than grief. Sophie Foster, now 27 and working as a nurse in Albany, received the call from Detective Carter while she was ending her shift at the hospital, where she had chosen to work specifically because helping people in crisis felt like the only way to make meaning from her mother's senseless death. The words seemed to echo in the hospital corridor where she stood, Carter's voice explaining that the man who had killed her mother was finally in custody, that there would be a trial, that justice was finally within reach. Ben Foster was 34 miles away in his apartment in Kingston, working on the computer programming degree he had pursued after years of drifting through jobs that never quite satisfied him. The phone call found him debugging code for a project that was due the next morning, and he saved his work with trembling fingers before calling his sister to confirm that they had both heard the same impossible news. Their father, Mark, had been dead for 3 years, his liver finally succumbing to the alcohol that had been his primary companion since Helen's death, meaning he would never know that his wife's killer had been identified and arrested. Rachel Foster was grading papers when Carter called her directly, offering the courtesy of personal notification to the woman who had dedicated nearly 2 decades to keeping Helen's case alive. Rachel set down her red pen and listened in silence as Carter explained about the fingerprint analysis, the arrest in Florida, and O'Connor's eventual confession. When the call ended, Rachel sat in her empty classroom for over an hour, surrounded by the math homework of 5th graders who had no idea their teacher had just learned that her life's obsession had finally reached its conclusion. The trial of James O'Connor began 14 months later in a Poughkeepsie courthouse, where the prosecution methodically presented evidence that connected a Florida mechanic to a crime that had haunted rural New York for nearly 2 decades. O'Connor's defense attorney argued that the confession had been coerced, that a fingerprint on a coffee cup proved nothing more than innocent contact, and that there had to be some explanation for his client's presence at what might have been a completely innocent encounter. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict of guilty on charges of second-degree murder and kidnapping. O'Connor received a sentence of 25 years to life, meaning he would be eligible for parole when he turned 77. Judge Patricia Williams noted during sentencing that while nothing could bring Helen Foster back to her family, the conviction represented a victory for both modern forensic science and the persistence of those who refused to let her case be forgotten. O'Connor showed no emotion as he was led from the courtroom in shackles, his face wearing the same blank expression that had characterized most of his court appearances. But justice, Rachel Foster discovered, felt different than she had expected. The resolution she had sought for 18 years brought a strange emptiness rather than the satisfaction she had anticipated. Her spare bedroom remained covered with photographs and timelines that no longer served any purpose, a shrine to an investigation that had finally ended. Sophie and Michael began the difficult process of rebuilding relationships with an aunt whose obsession had dominated their family dynamics for their entire adult lives. The white ceramic coffee cup that had solved the case was returned to evidence storage, where it would remain indefinitely as a testament to both the power of modern forensic science and the patient work of investigators who refused to let cold cases stay cold. Helen Foster's grave in Pine Hollow Cemetery received more visitors in the months following O'Connor's conviction than it had in the previous decade, as if the community needed to pay their respects to a woman whose death had finally been answered with justice. But late at night, when the visitors had gone home and the flowers had wilted, questions remained about what other secrets might be hidden in evidence rooms across the country, waiting for technology advanced enough to give voice to the silent witnesses of unsolved crimes.
If cases like Helen's fascinate you, stories where persistence and advancing forensic science finally bring answers to families who never stop believing in justice, consider subscribing to explore more mysteries where the truth emerges from the shadows after years of patient investigation. Sometimes the most powerful evidence speaks in whispers that only time and technology can amplify.